Bet y'all wondering when I'm going to show up. Actually, not to teach you, but we'll have an opening prayer. Our Father in heaven, we're so thankful, Father, for all the blessings of the day. We're thankful, Father, for the moisture. We ask, Father, that you help keep us warm in this day. We're thankful for the day that we come and worship you and study a portion of your word. Pray, Father, that be with all the teachers this hour. They'll have a ready remembrance of the things that they have here. Pray, Father, likewise for all the students for the hour. We pray that we have an open heart that receive your word. We ask, Father, that you continue to be with all members here, that uplift us all, encourage us, be good encouragers, those around about us. Help our light shine. Father, pray, Father, that you will help us to look to your word for that light. Help us to know you, to love you, serve you. Christ's name we pray.
Appreciate it. Thank you, guys. Well, good morning. It's good to be here this morning with all of y'all. Looking forward to this study this morning. Is one that I really want to dig into more, not because I feel like I have it all figured out, but because I wanted to learn more so I could help our family grow. We've been looking at a study over the last few weeks about the early Christians. We're doing character studies, and in particular, early Christians that have touched Paul's life in some way or another. Not necessarily from an aspect of looking at Paul himself, but just that's kind of the theme for the different characters that we've been choosing. And as we've gone through, we've looked at Jason, we've looked at Priscilla and Aquila, we've looked at Epaphroditus, we've looked at Epaphras. What has stood out to you about these early Christians? Maybe not coming necessarily from this study, but maybe some previous studies. But what stands out to you about these early New Testament Christians? I'm sorry, resilient. Resilient, yes. Eager to serve. That seems to be very clear. Keith. A zeal for the faith. That's right. That's right. A zeal for the brethren. Absolutely. Courageous. Yes. We see that time and time again, I feel like demonstrated. What else? Yeah. Yeah, so Sam's saying these guys were warriors. They took a lot for the faith, and absolutely, we see that demonstrated time and time again with really their lives on the line. That's right. Something that stood out to me, and I appreciated Nate bringing this out the other night, but he talked about how we really relate to these people, maybe more so than some of the characters in the Old Testament. For instance, I see some things with David, but I'm never going to be king over a nation. I see some similarities maybe with Abraham, but that guy had just unbelievable wealth. I'm just not going to be there. And yet, a lot of these early Christians we can relate to. I can relate to Aquila having to work for a living, but then trying to serve God. I can relate to these guys. Something else that has stood out to me as we've gone through this study is, we often see these characters, Paul mentions them towards the end of a letter. And it's interesting that as he goes through the letter and he's encouraging the brothers to be more who God wants them to be, a lot of the times at the end of the letter, the examples that he's giving of these people are people that are actually living out what Paul has been teaching in the letters. And I think we'll see a little bit more of that today. So let's turn over to 1 Corinthians chapter 1. We're going to look at our next couple characters that we're going to be looking at for the next couple of classes. So 1 Corinthians chapter 1. We're going to look at verse 16. And if you think about the context leading up to this, Paul makes his, what I would call a normal introduction through the first 9 verses. And then in verse 10, he starts talking about the divisions that are happening. And as we pick up in verse 14, he says, I thank God that I baptized none of you except Crispus and Gaius, so that no one may say that you are saved in my name. I did also baptize the household of Stephanas. Well, beyond that, I do not know whether I baptized anyone else. It's the household of Stephanas that we're going to be starting to look at this morning. 1 Corinthians chapter 16, if we go all the way to the end of the letter, we're going to pick up in verse 15. We're going to see really the only other reference that we have to the household of Stephanas and Stephanas himself. And it says in verse 15 of chapter 16, it says, Now I urge you, brothers, you know that the household of Stephanas were the first converts in Achaia, and that they have devoted themselves to the service of the saints. Be subject to such as these and to every fellow worker and laborer. I rejoice at the coming of Stephanas and Fortunatus and Achaicus, because they have made up for your absence. They refreshed my spirit as well as yours. Give recognition to such people. So that's what we have of Stephanas. And as we start to kind of look at him and look at his household, what are some things that stands out as we read these verses? What stands out to y'all? Keith.
Well, he talks about how faithful this man is, and especially in this particular congregation. We know that the church of Corinth had a lot of issues and problems. And so for him to be in that environment and trying to make things right, and it's there's no doubt that
And we see some of that point coming, maybe the Chloe's household telling of those things. But yes, if you could not hear Keith, Keith was talking about how faithful he was, especially maybe in a church that was struggling. What else as we go through this text? What else is standing out to you?
Therefore acknowledge such men is interesting. I don't know anywhere else where that happens. I'm not, don't memorize it, but I don't recognize that phrase coming out from Paul anywhere else in his letters.
Right.
Maybe there or something.
Yeah, yeah. So Wes is saying acknowledge such men, kind of that last phrase. And if I can just kind of ask you a follow-up question, like what sparked thoughts with that?
I just feel like it's like he's telling them to maybe give them some kind of honor, or at least like encouragement or pat on the back, some kind of, hey, you're doing good. Maybe it's some kind of reward. I don't know.
Right.
Hard to know that.
Right? Some type of recognition, maybe encouraging, maybe these to keep going, keep doing. That's great. What else? Yes, sir.
I have a footnote, and I don't know how much thought I put into this, but in verse 16, where it says, "Be subject to such as these, and to every fellow worker and laborer," it cross-references with 1 Thessalonians 5:12 and Hebrews 13, where it talks about those that serve over you, or leaders in the congregation. So he could have been one of those leaders in the congregation. I don't know if he was an elder or not, but somewhat of high regard in the context serves correctly, that someone to look after and help lead the congregation the right way.
So likely a leader in this congregation, someone to look up to. Yes. What else? Yes, sir.
Is this the same person that's referenced in Acts 18?
In Acts 18, can you give me the verse for it? Acts 18, verse 17. It says, and then they all seized Sosthenes, the ruler of the synagogue, and beat him in front of the tribunal. But Gallio paid no attention to any of this. So I'm assuming with the different names, Stephanus and Sosthenes, I'm assuming that that's different characters. Different characters. So what else? What else stands out to you? Yes, sir, Jamie.
So, I don't really know how intense of a comment this is going to be, but I find it interesting that Paul was here 18 months. And he makes the comment, the very first part of 1 Corinthians, that I didn't baptize any of you. Except, he mentions Crispus and Gaius, and, oh yeah, I forgot about the household of Stephanus,
Right.
but that's actually not very many people. And the church at Corinth seems to be a very large group. And, that's where Priscilla and Aquila, we first see them, and they were with Paul for, I would assume, that 18-month period of time. So I don't know that it's to say that there weren't Christians during the 18 months he was there. But maybe Paul wasn't the one who, yes, he preached, but maybe he wasn't a do everything kind of a guy. Maybe he had no problems with delegating, and they were working together, and they were doing all these different pieces. Stephanus, being mentioned there more deeply at the end of the chapter, seems to be very involved with preaching and teaching and the process.
Right. So I guess I was thinking as you were talking, and I think maybe even says they were some of the first fruits of the work there. And so just kind of continuing on with this line of thought, as possibly they were a big part of why maybe the church was growing in some ways. Sure. What else? What else stands out to you with these verses? Do you notice the word household? It's kind of interesting to me to think about. It doesn't mention just Stephanus. I mean, we see, in verse 17, it talks about, I rejoice at the coming of Stephanus. But it's kind of interesting to me that he mentions it's the household of Stephanus. He mentioned it twice, once at the beginning of the letter, once at the end. The household. So who might that entail besides Stephanus? Yeah, wife.
possibly his
Yeah, possibly parents. I mean, we could kind of go on a little bit. This could include, maybe servants and slaves. Could be children, and kind of on down. But it seems to be, we're looking at, if you look at the Greek word, it's talking about everyone that's living within that house. That's an interesting that it has household and not just the person himself. And if you think about it, what are some of the households that we can look at throughout the Old Testament? Adam and Eve, I don't really see them as being great, that household being great servants to the people around them. Think about Noah. That one's kind of an intriguing thought in some ways because, you see them, him and his sons building an ark, maybe Noah preaching and them being willing to take other people in. So maybe that would be a good example for us to look at. Abraham, maybe our next big one, character. And we see his hospitality and his servanthood. But then you start going on after that. You think about the household of Isaac. That really wasn't a household that really served, I don't think. What about Jacob? And then you start thinking about, okay, we go to maybe Moses and Aaron and some of the issues that God even put a couple of Aaron's sons to death. Joshua, I think about that phrase, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. I think there's a good example. But then we go to someone like Eli with his household, or someone like Samuel and his household, or Saul, or David. David, we actually have a lot on his household. Even think about some of the good kings of Judah, like Hezekiah. Hezekiah having a household that had Manasseh in it. It's just kind of interesting to me as we think about a lot of these Old Testament characters, as we look at someone that has a household that we should model after. A lot of the leaders of the Israelites did not have that. And yet I think here we have an example of a household that is serving the people around them. Keith.
Well, one thing that you do notice, especially in the writings of the New Testament, how many people that we hear about that when they were baptized, them and their whole house. I mean, you got Cornelius, him and his whole house. Lydia, her whole house. The jailer, him and his whole house. So you see a lot of families or groups who are obeying, and that particular group is being faithful. Either they're starting a work or that is the work, right there. And so you see a lot of that and I think that's what it's there for. For example, showing that the whole bunch here was all in for Jesus. So not just a portion of them, the whole bunch was in for Jesus. They're ready, to be servants of the kingdom.
I like what you're bringing out. If you cannot hear him, he's talking about the household of the Philippian jailer, the household of, I'm trying to think of the Jewish, or who was the one that Peter was sent to? Cornelius, the household of Cornelius. We have several references in the book of Acts of households being converted. And it kind of goes back to, I think, the point Nate was making Wednesday night, is it's these New Testament Christians that we can relate to very well. And then I like the idea, too, that it's a household serving Jesus. And really, that is really the direction that we're headed this morning. If you also look, I really like in verse 15, they have devoted themselves to the service of the saints. Maybe your version say the ministry of the saints, but however you look at it, they are actively involved. Yes, sir.
This could be reading too much into it, but it almost seems as if the household even specifically include these guys except for Cornelius
So you're bringing out a lot of interesting thoughts to think about. And if you did not hear him, he was talking about how possibly, as we look at, mentioned the household of Stephanus, and then it mentions three men, possibly maybe these three men were all part of the same household. I think either way you look at it, we're looking at a household that has multiple people in it serving God. And that's an interesting thought. And really, it's what we're striving for, I think, as creating our own households uh, and working towards that. So excellent thoughts. Is there anything else y'all want to add before we look at? Yes, ma'am.
Tying back into last week, we were talking about slavery, and made a little bit of a distinction between like being a servant and being a slave. I had been thinking about if I'm a servant or if I just have a job, I go to that and I come, but it's not my um, if I'm going to serve at something, I may go serve on the weekend,
Right.
then I'm done.
Right.
As a slave, just looking at maybe our own experience, South when we had slavery, as a slave, that was your whole life. Typically, your family was going to be there in slavery with you. That was your life. That was your home. That was all you were about. And then going forward household here, they're not just going off to some job and coming back home, just doing this job. When their job was done, thinking back to the slavery, they don't have their own occupation, but they were, whenever they get a break, they come work with the master. That master, they only, everything they did was to serve their own household. For a slave, truly a slave, you're going to be bringing home.
And I think it's an interesting thought you're bringing out, just the idea of their, look, there's a word in there, devoted, and the commitment, like you're talking about, the commitment to serving others. Cal and then Nate, yeah.
I have one question, comment, I think. Looking back a bit to verse 15, chapter 16 of Corinthians, says, Stephanus and his household were the first of the harvest of believers in Greece. Typically, things that were referred to as Greek, we talk about they're no longer Jew nor Greek, Jew or Gentile, so things that were typically not Jewish are referred to as Greek. People that were not Jewish were referred to as Asia, and it was where Paul went into Athens. Thought that they did possibly step. And the reason he has the prominence to be in the scriptures, all the people that did great things that to be in the scriptures and recognize it's possible.
It sure seems like that. When I think about the name of Stephanus, I think Gentile, Greek name. Yeah, yeah. And especially, if we think about what Justin is saying, and if they all are tied together, I mean, some of these others certainly seem to me more of the Greek names versus the Hebrew. Yeah.
And referring again to that they are spending their life in service to God's people. Now that would be a general term, yes, there's certain church, but just that it just emanates to me that significance of what they're doing because of who they are.
Right.
They are Gentile, makes it a little more
It really does, because this is a complete change, and not just one person, but a group of people that have changed and are serving. Yeah, it's really neat. Nate?
Picking up on this word devoted service, the saying, devoted service. In each one of these cases that we're looking at, these are not people who just are good people. It's not about what they're not doing, which is a lot of times the way we look at Christianity. It is about what they are doing. This is what's making the difference. And this is why they're mentioned in Scripture. They're not mentioned in Scripture because they don't have sex with somebody else. It's not their mate. They're not mentioned in Scripture because
Yeah, and I think, yeah, I really like that, not being mentioned because of what they're not doing, but because of what they are doing, benefiting the people around them. Yes, good thoughts. Keith?
I'd like to take a little further than what Nathan even said. If you look at verse 18, where he says, "For these have refreshed my spirit and yours, therefore acknowledge ye them that are such." He refers to these people that I have written you a letter that's, I'm chastising you. You've got a lot of things you've got to fix in this congregation. I'm also writing a letter that because what I've heard, isn't all bad. There's some good stuff. That's a refreshing. Now, my spirit has been refreshed because there are some good things you are doing. And he's, recognize these men who have talked good about you, that are leading this congregation, that are trying to do what is right. Recognize who these people are.
And to me, it's kind of it's almost like, okay, for the Corinthians, we're going to go through all these things, and this is what we need to be doing to be getting back on track. But then at the end of, here's an example of people that are already there, already doing it for you guys to look up to. I think that's right. That's right. A lot of good comments. So I'd like to flip over to 2 Timothy, and let's look at one other character. We're going to kind of combine these two together as we start to kind of dig into this even more. A lot of good thoughts this morning. Appreciate them. So 2 Timothy chapter 1, if you think about Paul is at the end of his life, and he's writing this letter to Timothy to tell Timothy some things, but he's also at the end of the letter saying, Timothy, please come. Please come see me. And he was talking in chapter 1, and we'll pick up in verse 15 about just the number of people that have kind of abandoned him as he's been on this last round of trials. So chapter 1 and verse 15, it says, "You are aware of all who in Asia turned away from me, among whom are Phygelus and Hermogenes. May the Lord grant mercy to the household of Onesiphorus, for he often refreshed me and was not ashamed of my chains. But when he arrived in Rome, he searched for me earnestly and found me. May the Lord grant him to find mercy from the Lord on that day. And you well know all the service he rendered at Ephesus." Now, if we flip over towards the end of the letter, in chapter 4 and verse 19, we have kind of those last greetings, greet Priscilla and Aquila, and then it goes on to mention the household of Onesiphorus. Now, I have to admit, I did do some research last night trying to figure out how to say Onesiphorus, and the different sources each said it a little different way. So I thought, I think I could just say it how I think in my mind. But what stands out to you now? We've looked at the household of Stephanas. Now as we come to the household of Onesiphorus, what stands out to you about him and his household? Yeah, just, knowing that Paul's in prison and coming to search for him. And I thought about that a little bit. They just doesn't type it into his GPS to navigate. I mean, that probably was a search to find the right house or wherever he was staying, the prison. Yeah, that would have been a feat in of itself. Yes, sir. Yeah, I like I like that thought, just going beyond just kind of what we think of just staying pure and coming to services. He's actually out and doing. Jordan.
On those lines too, you read, it talks about him doing service at Ephesus, and
Right.
is, I mean, when you look at the world at that time, that's almost from one end of the world to the other. You know, going out and looking for him. I mean, who knows where he was? He could have been Ephesus. He could have been somewhere close by to Rome. But regardless, this man was traveling, doing the Lord's work wherever he was going. And he was dedicated on a mission to serve God at all costs, especially going to Rome when, you know, to your point, trying to find Paul in the midst of the capital of the world at that time, and trying to figure out where he is without himself getting caught or killed. I mean, there's a lot here to unpack when you think about what this guy went through in order just to find his brother, encourage him.
Yeah, that, just not ashamed of his change. I mean, no telling what he had to do to go find Paul. But then I thought you brought out another good point is the fact that he was serving in Ephesus, and here's just an extension of his service is going to Rome and going through all of that. What else? What else stands out to you about this? Yes, sir.
They both didn't go with the crowd.
Yes.
They could have said, Stephanus picked up.
Right.
God sees those that, when everyone else was we stuck with it. God picked up the slack, and they were the ultimate workers.
Yeah. Yeah. So Heath was talking about how they stuck with it. I mean, maybe as the Corinthian church is kind of headed in a bad direction, they're standing strong. Here too, when everyone's deserting Paul, here is Onesiphorus sticking with him. I thought I saw a hand back here. Jamie?
Yeah, I may be reading way too much into this, but I find it interesting that he's asking for mercy on the house of Onesiphorus, not for Onesiphorus and his house. It almost makes you wonder if Onesiphorus, in his process to find Paul and help Paul and serve Paul, may have died himself in the process, because then he asks for blessings once again on the house of Onesiphorus at the end of it. I don't know, it almost seems like he's speaking of him in past tense, but
Yeah.
actively right now in the present tense, a blessing upon that house.
Yeah, it's kind of an interesting approach to, what he's saying. Yeah, it's definitely that part of it is very intriguing, how he's looking at that. Good thoughts. Yes, Justin?
I kind of identify with people who are not named this because there's probably a lot of people that thought about Paul. Like, I wonder how Paul's doing. I wonder where he's at right now. Maybe I should go visit him one day. And maybe I can do something to improve. And you have these thoughts, good intention, but they never turn into anything. Whereas Onesiphorus, like, saddled up before the river. And he actually goes
Right.
to Rome and makes that happen.
Yeah. And you think about his household being left, just kind of, I mean, this was at least probably several month journey to get there and do whatever he's doing. And anyway, this is a long process. It's not just a thought, it is an action. That's very good. Yes, sir.
May just be me, but I see a lot of similarity in the second, third chapters of Revelation.
Yes. Yes. In what ways?
Well, he points out their faults in Revelation, but he also points out their things that they're done.
Yes.
Gives them a thought.
Yeah. Yes, yes, and we kind of see Paul kind of bringing out some of these good qualities of some of these people in a similar way. Yeah. So, as we looked at these two houses, we've made some, passing comments, but how do they compare to each other? You're going to compare the household of Stephanus with the household of Onesiphorus. What are some comparisons that we can make? Nate?
Both had huge influence on the congregation where they were.
Right. They were.
Both had
Oh, yes, yeah.
Meniscus.
Meniscus, yeah.
He says that not meniscus. And so, these are very characteristic things that he is placing on certain people who, again, are pushing themselves in there, pushing themselves forward. It's great to be who we ought to be once again, but, and not do things that we shouldn't be doing. But these are the people who are surging forward and doing more than what is required of them to be considered going to heaven by God. And that is really an important point. How do I refresh my brethren? What do I do that refreshes people around me? Am I willing to put myself out there in order for that to happen, or does it just happen because I see them here on Sunday morning or something? To think further ahead than that, I think it's really important to be the kind of servants that we're looking at here. I love the word refresh.
Right. Yeah, you bring out a really good thought. And I was thinking as you're talking, he was concerned, they were working within just the local congregation, but they had a worldly kingdom vision as well. Okay, I'm headed to go help Paul. They know the work he's doing, and they're helping Paul. They're going out. They're not concerned just with the local work, but their concern is for the entire kingdom. And that is neat. Yes, ma'am.
I guess the word household,
Yes.
most of them have household, which to me indicates a good leader. If your household's going to follow, and generally the leader is a good example.
Yeah. And you bring out a really good point. She was talking about how the household is mentioned both times. And typically, if you have a good household, you have a good leader. And it is interesting. I mean, even if you look back in chapter 4, if you're still there, if you just go on and he just keeps talking about different names. Erastus remained at Corinth. Trophimus, who was ill at Miletus, do your best to come before winter. Eubulus sends greetings, as do Pudens, Linus, Claudia, and all the brothers. There's a lot of names mentioned there, but Paul doesn't use the name, the household of so-and-so, very often. In fact, we have the household of Stephanus and the household of Onesiphorus. I'm not sure that he mentions in his letters the household of very many more people than that. So that is something very unique about those two. So as I think about this a little bit more, these are great examples for us to strive to. I mean, I'm in the position of still raising a lot of children. To me, this is such a great bar to be aiming for. The example set forth by Stephanus, by Onesiphorus, and their households. And I think we have just a great mark to be shooting for. So I'd like to kind of dive into that as we kind of go forward a little bit more. 1 Corinthians is where we'll be spending a lot more time coming up. I'd like to leave with some closing thoughts. 1 Corinthians chapter 3. So I think about the Corinthian church. We've kind of talked about it some already. They had a lot of just questions. We see that in the letters. They have some issues that need to be addressed that Paul is addressing. And Paul is really working to build this church up and try and get them headed in the direction that he'd like to see them go, and a direction that follows God and being more of who God wants them to be. And so as I looked at this, I would like to just kind of look at some of these things that Paul is telling the Corinthians, because if it applies to the church family, then it applies to the families that make up, the households that make up the church family as well. So if we look at 1 Corinthians 3, let's start in verse 10. 1 Corinthians 3 and verse 10. It says, according to the grace of God given to me, like a skilled master builder, I laid a foundation and someone else is building upon it. Let each take care of how he builds upon it. Let no one lay a foundation other than which is laid, which is Jesus Christ. Now, if anyone builds on the foundation with gold, silver, precious stones, wood, hay, straw, Each one's work will become manifest, for the day will disclose it, because it will be revealed by fire, and fire will test what sort of work each one has done. If the work that anyone has built on the foundation survives, he will receive a reward. If anyone's work is burned up, he will suffer loss, though he himself will be saved, but only as through fire. So if we start to make some application down to the household level, I was thinking about this. You know, when you and your wife, if you're married, you know, when we first were married, when we were newlyweds, we had a foundation. We had a foundation of Jesus. But there wasn't a lot more to our structure compared to it is now, likely. Day by day, we're adding a little bit more to it. We're building upon this foundation. And sometimes it is with gold and silver. Sometimes it was with hay and straw. But every day, all the choices we're making, all the things that we're choosing to pursue or not pursue, each child that we add to the family, to the household, we're building that household day by day as we go. And my thought is, going forward, what are we using to build it? We have a great example of Stephanus and Onesiphorus and how they really reached who we want to model our families after, a family that serves. So what are our building blocks? What are the building blocks, the types of materials that we are using to build our households? And we just have a couple minutes, so I hate to dive in too much, so let me just ask this question. Different types of materials I mentioned: gold, silver, precious stones. We also have kind of wood, hay, straw. Those type of materials are burned up in fire. These others seem to be more refined by fire. So what are some ways that this, or maybe what does this gold, silver, precious stones, what do they represent when we're building a household? What do these stones represent? Yes, ma'am. Wisdom. Yeah, something that's going to withstand the testing of fire. Absolutely. Wisdom. What else? Yeah, quality. A variety of quality. It's not just one component. Yeah, strength. Yes, things that will stand it. You know, I was thinking about, you know, to me, sometimes I wonder if the wood, straw, hay, and obviously Paul's got a direction he's going, but as we think about building our household, to me they seem more physical in nature, things that will burn up with the testing of time, whereas some of these others are more precious, have more of a spiritual nature to them. Thank y'all for all your comments this morning. Appreciate it.